Hello, and welcome to another episode of Scenery with Sorastro. In this video, I'll be sharing the techniques and resources I've been using to create some urban terrain, designed to be used for games like Marvel Crisis Protocol and any modern-day superhero or even zombie-themed miniatures game. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the wonderful work of Mel, the terrain tutor, whose videos taught me so much whilst I was preparing for this project, and I'll be referencing some of his work during this guide. The techniques I've used to build the terrain are actually quite simple, and although it still takes a fair bit of patience, attention to detail, and time, I find the process to be incredibly rewarding and fun. Here's a brief overview of how I'll be creating the terrain. I'll be constructing the walls and roofs for the buildings out of foam board, before exploring a couple of options for providing some texture, as well as fitting some windows and doors. These can then be glued together to create the basic buildings. We can then have some fun applying various finishing touches and extra details to really help add some character and create a sense of urban decay. I'll also be using some magnets to allow for some movable elements that won't slide around or be easily knocked over during gameplay. Let's begin, however, with a quick look at the boards I'm setting the terrain on. I chose to build the terrain on 4 18-inch square MDF tiles, which are 9mm thick, each with some road running along 2 of the edges. These can then be arranged in a variety of ways to create a 3-foot square gaming area. We could have a crossroads, as you can see here, or 2 blocks of buildings with a road running down the centre, or a single cluster of buildings with road running around the edge. With each layout, several variations are of course possible, depending on which specific tiles you place where. I didn't actually film the creation of the boards, as I simply followed the wonderful tutorial by Mel, the terrain tutor, making urban wargaming boards, which involves the use of sandpaper for the roads and foam board for the rest, and you can watch and learn from that video yourself following the link on the screen and in the video description. You should feel free to decide on your own precise dimensions for the road and paving tiles, but here you can see that each of my pavements measures 30 cm up to the corner section, and I've created 3 cm square paving tiles, along with a 5mm wide curb. You'll see a bit later on how I created the slightly rough texture you can see on the pavement, and for the road markings I just masked off the surrounding area and stippled on the paint with a large cheap brush. Once I'd made the tiles, I then sketched out what the layout of each one might look like, to help visualise how they'd look when placed next to one another in a variety of combinations. I would then plan out each tile, making decisions about the precise dimensions, placement of windows and doors, and what kind of textures I might use for each wall. You should feel free to work to any scale you like, of course, but most of my buildings generally have a ground floor measuring 100mm in height, with each subsequent floor above measuring 75mm, such as you can see here. I also tried to think about what each building might actually be, and I aimed to create a balance of both residential and commercial properties. This is my friend Julio's woodshop, for example, and I find business cards are quite useful when it comes to creating signage. This building was inspired by our local gaming venue, the Dice Saloon. And the tile I'm building for this video is based on a local pub, the World's End, because I like the distinctive design on the front. After planning the dimensions of the building, I always like to start by placing down a foam board base, which needs to measure 10mm less, to allow for the fact that the outer walls will also be made of 5mm foam board. You can see the dimensions of my base circled here in red. And here you can see I've already cut the base out and glued it down with some PVA glue, and you can also see where the walls are going to go in a moment. When working out the final measurements for each wall, it's worth considering how you're going to handle the corners, as we don't really want to show the edge of the foam board. There are some tricks for doing this, as detailed in another of Mel's videos. However, as I'm going to be sticking down some brick textures, all I need to do is ensure that I plan for the exposed edge to show only on those walls which I'll be sticking the textured sheets onto. For this particular building, I'm creating a slightly rendered texture for the front, and will be sticking some brick textured sheets on the side, so that's where I'll be allowing the edge of the foam board to show for the time being. It's then simply a question of planning out the dimensions of each facet of the building, and carefully measuring the shapes out on the foam board, before cutting them out with a nice sharp blade. When measuring things out, I like to label what I'm doing to help to avoid any confusion. And it's always worth checking each piece against the base to ensure we've measured and cut correctly. Now I've cut all the wall pieces out for the main building, I'm working out the dimensions for the smaller side building, which you could just make as an entirely separate block if you like. And here I'm calculating the dimensions of the roof, which will have the same width as the base as I want it to fit snugly inside the walls. I'm then going to create a ledge just for the larger roof that I want to overhang slightly, as you can see here. I've chosen to have the ledge extend beyond the wall by 3 mm on each side, so I'll be adding 6 mm to the width of each wall to get the measurements for the trim, which is also going to measure 10 mm in width. I've chosen to use 3 mm thick foam board for this instead of the 5, to make the ledge look a little less like it's made of standard foam board. Here I'm just checking that all the parts fit correctly before moving on. I'm now going to provide some texture, and for the brick walls I'm using some embossed sheets by Knock. These come in a range of designs, and for this building I'm using the red brick wall texture. You can see, however, that I like to vary the texture from one building or wall to the next to maintain visual interest. When planning the measurements, I need to ensure that I allow for the extra 5 mm required at either end to cover up the exposed edge of the adjoining walls. If there are any odd breaks in the texture like you can see here, I'll be sure to trim them back to allow me to create a seamless join from one piece to the next. And I'm now spreading a layer of PVA over the back before gluing into place. These can be pressed down whilst drying to reduce any warpage. For the side building, I'd like to fit a large rolling door made with corrugated card stuck to 3 mm foam board. It's a small detail, but I'd like to have the brick texture wrap around the inside of the entrance, so I've measured a 5 mm flap on either side, which I'm going to gently score so I can then easily fold it back. This just gives a slightly neater finish once the door is fitted. Here I'm using these blocks just to hold things firmly in place whilst the glue dries. For most of the windows I'm using these, which are O-scale windows from Tichy Train Group in the US. They come in a couple of pieces but are reasonably priced and easy to install. First I'm gluing the two pieces together with plastic glue, which can be done in an open or closed position, and I'll be adding a glass effect later on. I'm also using one of their doors for the front of the building. I'm now playing around with the layout of the different elements, which includes some wooden lettering from Hobbycraft. Once I'm happy, I'm going to calculate the exact size and placement of the windows and doors, taking the dimensions from the back of each one, which is slightly smaller than the outer frame. We can then carefully measure and cut out the required holes so the windows and door should slot in nicely from the front. Here you can see I've drawn out a grid to ensure the windows are all neatly aligned. These windows are quite forgiving because the frame itself does a nice job of hiding any small overcuts we may have made. Before heading over to the airbrush to paint these up, I'm going to score a 2 cm square grid pattern onto the surface of the main roof using a biro, just to add some interest. And here I'm just lightly sanding the edges of the roof ledge to hide the telltale lip of the foam board. To add a subtle texture, I'm going to thin down some basic filler or spackling paste with some water. And I'm simply going to stipple this on in a thin layer over the entire surface to create a slightly rough or rendered looking finish. This is just one more thing we can do to make the building look less like it was made out of foam board. I'm also using this for the ledge, as well as for any of the walls that I didn't apply a brick texture to. Any warpage that occurs can be fixed by simply bending the foam board back into shape, and I actually quite like some of the lines that may appear as a result. I'm now priming all of the windows and doors along with the roof and the non-brick walls in black. And because I want it to be a fair bit lighter, I'm priming the ledge in grey. Here I'm using Vallejo Model Airs black mixed with a little steel blue to create a more interesting tone for the front of the building. And here I've also mixed in a little Stonewall grey to provide a gentle zenithal highlight for the windows as well as the doors. This side door is actually from the 3D Doors and Barricades pack from the original Zombicide. For the roof, you can see I'm building up the brightness towards the middle to create sort of a vignette. I'm doing this with the addition of some Stonewall grey. And here I've also added a little Bonewhite. For the ledge, I've used a mix of just Stonewall grey and Bonewhite. Here on this outer wall, I'm also using the same set of tones to create a gentle gradient to add interest. It was only later on that I realised I've actually added the texture and paint to the wrong side. Stippling the colours on with a large brush instead can also produce some nice effects. After providing a quick coat of varnish, I'm sticking down the small pieces of clear plastic that come with the kits to look like glass. And I'm now fitting the windows and doors with some thin superglue. The windows you can see here are from York Model Rail and are a little more tricky to fit as they have to be installed from the back of the wall, which requires scooping out some of the foam. But the company does make some quite nice brick headers such as you can see here, although they are pretty expensive. Next I'm gluing the ledge to the main roof using PVA glue to allow me time to adjust the position before pressing it down to dry. I'm now gluing down a 10mm wide strip of the brick texture to the top of the inside walls of the small side building. And directly beneath that, I'm gluing down a ledge of foam board upon which the roof will eventually sit in a slightly sunken position, leaving 5mm of the brick wall showing above. For the large roof, I'm also fitting some supporting ledges, this time leaving just a 5mm gap above, since I want the roof to sit flush with the walls. Here I'm using this spare piece of foam board to ensure I've glued the ledge down in the correct position. I've now made a start on gluing the walls into place, and I'm once again using PVA glue for this. Once I've got a piece of wall in position, I'm using pins to hold things firmly in place whilst the glue dries. Another fantastic tip I picked up from Mel the terrain tutor. I'm avoiding the use of any kind of tape, however, to prevent damaging the brick texture. Because the front of the building has quite an intricate design, I'm going to work on it separately before gluing it in place. For the signage, I'm sticking down the wooden letters from Hobbycraft, which I've painted white. I've got a piece of black card to use as the back panel, and I'm temporarily sticking down this plastic strip just to help me position the letters correctly. This can then be glued in place. Notice that I've left a 2mm gap at either end so I can fit some corner strips later on. I'm also gluing down a couple of styrene strips either side, made by Albion Hobbies, which I've painted black. And I've also glued down a couple of unpainted strips at the top of the building. I'm now sketching out the design of the Kraken in pencil, and you can also see I've blacked out the windows of the middle floor, just as can be seen on the pub I'm replicating. And I'm now using a roughly equal mix of white and ivory, plus a little flow enhancer, to paint the design on. This took me around 2 to 3 hours to complete, and should give me many more hours of enjoyment for years to come. We can now glue the wall to the rest of the building. And this completes the basic build. Once dry, we can remove the pins, and I'm now checking to see how well the roof fits to the building. If it doesn't quite fit, it could be that the walls are bowing slightly in the middle, in which case we can slot in some additional foam board to brace the walls and maintain a firm shape. We can also shave a fraction off the edge of the roof itself if necessary. We now have a nice snug fit. For the smaller roof, I'm just using some filler to give a more solid, even finish to the top of the perimeter. This can be thinned a little to allow us to brush it on more evenly, and can be lightly sanded and painted later on if you like. Next, I'm going to glue some angled styrene strips onto the corners of the building. You can see I've primed these in black to match the front. These strips come in a wide range of dimensions and are a great way of giving us neat corners, and should also provide a little extra protection. I might also glue down some rectangular strips along the base of the building, which is a great way of covering up any unwanted gaps. This is actually a cylindrical strip. With that done, I'm now going to paint the ground surrounding the building, firstly with Vallejo's Stonewall Grey. I'm now mixing in some black along with some dark sea blue, and I'm thinning this down a fair bit. I'm then using this to roughly block in some areas of shadow in the alleyway and along the base of the building. This can be loosely thinned and stippled to create a rough gradient and some interesting textures. I'm pushing the depth a little further still. Next Next I'm going to add some chewing gum marks simply using some grey felt tip pens. Finally, I'm going to provide a light sprinkling of this urban scatter by Jarvis over a layer of thinned PVA. Next, I'm just extending the Kraken's tentacle around the side of the building. I'm now going to provide some patches of weathering and streaky stains using a mix of typhus corrosion and Nuln oil, which I've also thinned with a few drops of Larmian medium. Here I'm adding some scuffs and scratches to the doors using a few different shades of grey. I'm also brushing on some of the brown mix we made a moment ago, but thinned a little further. I'm now going to glue on a fire escape, which is also made by Tichy Train Group using superglue. These require a fair bit of assembly, and by default they're wide enough to stretch across a couple of windows, but are easy enough to modify to fit over just one if need be. I'm now going to do some set dressing using some scenic pieces by Antonosity's workshop, which you can see I've already painted up ready to go. These are made of resin, except for the aircon units, which are actually made of MDF and card. You'll likely be able to source similar items wherever you are, or have them printed out if you have access to a 3D printer. I've also chosen to magnetize most of these pieces to allow them to be easily moved, but also to prevent them from sliding around. For these telephones, for example, I've glued on a 1mm thick, 10mm diameter magnet on the back, and a corresponding 15mm magnet on the inside wall. And the phones snap nicely into place. For these bins, I'm using a slightly thicker 2mm magnet, simply because there's some extra space due to the slant of the model at the back. And I'm once again using a 15mm magnet on the inside wall. I'm also installing some magnets into the pavement. To do that, I'm first cutting along one of the joins between the paving stones. We can then slide the knife or other thin tool into the gap to clear some space. And the magnet should then easily slide into place, and we can seal the join with some glue. This is ideal for securing things like newspaper stands and traffic lights. When building these aircon units, I also glued in some magnets. So naturally, I'll be doing the same for the roof. I'm now gluing this smaller roof down with some PVA. But I'm just dry fitting the larger roof in case I decide to install any additional magnets or possibly some lighting at a future date. For this roof, I've also magnetised some conduits, which are actually from Games Workshop. I'm now laying down some tables which I scratch built out of balsa wood, coffee stirrers and matchsticks. And I find these 1:43 scale die-cast cars also make a nice addition to the board. Finally, I'm going to add some graffiti, posters and litter, using a combination of decals and various bits of ripped up business cards, flyers and printed out imagery. To use these decals, we simply soak the transfer in some water for 5 seconds or so. We then wet the surface slightly. slide the transfer off and onto the wall. We can then dab off any excess water and brush on some setting solution. A lot of this graffiti I've simply drawn on myself with pen or brush. These little chimney stacks are also from Tichy Train Group. As is this road sign, which you can see I'm adding some weathering to, and which I've also glued directly onto a magnet. On some of the other tiles, you'll notice I also have some O-scale fencing, which I've mounted onto some strips of balsa wood. I might also add a couple of tufts of grass. Apart from spraying on some thinned PVA for protection, I'm calling this done for now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the episode. Do please note you'll find a full product list of the resources used in the video description, and as always, I'd be happy to respond to any questions or comments you may have about the project. My sincerest thanks go to my wonderful patrons for funding these videos. I simply couldn't produce this kind of work without their kind generosity. Join me again soon, and happy painting!